Right, well, hello. Let's go ahead and just get started, right? How are you guys doing? Pretty crazy right now, right? I'm just going to jump right into it. I want to talk about, first of all, let's just lay the groundwork. Let's lay the basis here. Let's talk about the political compass. So I know a lot of you guys see tests like this. The most common one is this kind of square. You have other models of political compass. I don't know if you can call this a compass, but you have this test, the 8 values test. Some people have this sort of thing. I'm not sure how this thing works, but you got something like this. I've seen three-dimensional ones. Let's look that up real fast. So in this one, you got conservatism versus socialism. That doesn't seem right. Nationalism versus liberalism, totalitarian versus libertarian. I don't know. So individualism versus collectivism, progressive versus conservative, libertarian versus totalitarianism, socialist versus capitalist, individualist versus collectivist, authoritarian versus anarchist. You have different models of how to model politics, but the reality is, and the hard part about making a political compass, is that there are as many dimensions to your political compass, essentially, as there are uh, different kinds of political opinions you can have on different topics. So, for example, there is a axis related to, I don't know, let's say economics, right? What is the taxation rate? How do you really represent that on a two-dimensional graph? Because it's not simply a question of 1 or 2, 0 or 1. It's not binary. Um, and you can have progressive taxation systems where you have, different income brackets. Then that's a whole question of, for each bracket, where do you draw the line in each bracket? 0 to 30,000 a year, 30 to 40, 40 to 100,000. I'm just making up random numbers. 100,000 to 400,000, 400,000 to 3 million, right? Where do you draw those lines? And there's a million different answers to that question. What tax rate do you apply to each of those tax brackets? And there's a million different answers to that question. So how many axes are there really? How do you actually quantify? How do you actually determine how many axes there are just for a question like that? Then we get into questions of, personal liberties. If we use the standard sort of square political compass, we're going to pull this one up and just kind of keep this in front of us. If we use this thing, can I find a picture that is actually a decent size? Um, and I would take these, by the way, I'd take these with a huge grain of salt whenever you see them broken up like this. You'll find a million different versions of these kind of political compasses with people putting boxes in different areas. So, for example, progressivism might be here, someone else might consider it to be over here. But the point I'm making is, how do in this model, you have a social axis, and on the bottom end is libertarianism, and on the top end is authoritarianism. And the idea is that the more you want to have the government come in and regiment the way people live their personal lives, the more authoritarian, the more you want, just kind of a free for all, let people do whatever they want, the more anarchic you get. So you got like anarcho right here, anarcho mutualism. Somewhere in here we have anarchism. But in reality, right, you take one axis like this, you've just compacted a bunch of issues into one axis, because someone might consider, let's say, legalizing all drugs to be libertarian, fall on this end of the graph. But it's possible that there are people who simultaneously think that drugs should be illegal, which would traditionally go up here on this end of the graph, but at the same time they believe, this isn't me by the way, just disclaimer, they believe you should be able to lower the age of consent, right? Anarchy, no rules on social behaviors. And so where do you place that, right? Are those things truly sharing the same axis? Well, not really, because you could have people, decide they want to have full legalization of marijuana and other drugs, but then simultaneously think that you should have very strict guidelines around sex, around gender, around marriage. Okay, well, are they more libertine? Are they more anarchistic? Or are they more authoritarian? Well, it depends on the issue, right? So you can really have an axis for drugs. You can have an axis for gender. You can have another axis for sex. You can have another axis for marriage. You will get people that will answer different questions on all of these. So how many axes do you truly have? You probably have about as many axes as there are different political topics. And we have political topics that relate from everything from workplace safety standards, how many days a week do you work, child labor laws, drug laws, sex, gender, marriage laws, taxation laws, um, laws around jaywalking, laws around do you need to have a license to drive a vehicle? Do you not need a license to drive a vehicle? How do you structure a criminal justice system? Do the police have auditors that are part or quasi part of the police force? Are they independent auditors? Do you have private? Do you have public cooperatives? Do you have progressive taxation? Do you have public ownership of the means of production? You don't have to answer, for example, if you're economically left wing, maybe you want public ownership of the means of production, but at the same time, you want taxation to be really low. Does that make sense? And perhaps that doesn't really make sense because if you have public ownership, maybe the taxation is irrelevant there. But you get the idea that I'm getting at, which is that you have different questions around economics. I think the troubling thing, the hard thing, maybe it's not really troubling, but the hard thing about creating a model for politics is because you have so many different topics, so many different questions, and what people are trying to do when they create a political model of ideology is they're trying to figure out, okay, is there a few underlying values that people have that will predict how they answer a variety of economics questions or a variety of social questions or a variety of these questions, instead of having a million different political axes, a million different variables. Is it possible to find a few smaller underlying variables? This all gets into psychology now at this point, where now we're talking about things like, like the big five personality tests. And the big five, let's look up the big five real fast because I'm going to get these wrong if I don't look them up. Big five personality test. I believe, if I'm correct, I believe openness is correlated with liberalism, for example, right? But is it possible to take, right? Number one, in psychology, is it even possible to make a model like this that actually tells you like the fundamental traits of someone's personality? Because the big five is the popular one, but there's actually a lot of different ones. There's, what is it, the 16 types? There's all kinds of different personality tests out there. What are we really testing for? How do you take personality and turn it into a thing where you have just a small handful of different variables that explains every personality and every individual in society? I don't know. By the way, this starts to get into the hard problem of consciousness, the hard problems in psychology, which is not just looking at the biology of the brain, but theories of the mind. Because we can look at the brain, we can look at brain imaging, we can look at brain patterns, we can look at the anatomy of the brain, but does that tell you what personality is? Does that tell you how personality works? Can you, for example, figure out which genes are associated with each personality? How do you do that, right? Really hard questions to answer. So there is a connection there, I could say, very arrogantly, with like 80% confidence. There's a connection between personality and, well, genetics, but more importantly, there's a connection between personality and political ideology. Your politics are downstream from your psychology. Your politics are downstream from your ethics. Your ethics are downstream from your personality. But what are the fundamental factors that predict everything else? We don't have a nice, neat model for that yet as a society, as a, as humans in science. We don't have it. It doesn't exist yet. Maybe we get closer and closer every year. Maybe we'll figure out at one point in time. But right now, a lot of people use this model, and it's pretty crude. It's pretty rudimentary. I like this one, even though it's not perfect. But to give you a crash course real fast by looking at this, what do these terms mean? If you're not familiar with politics, you don't know what these things are. What is fascism, for example? That word gets thrown around a lot. I find that when I ask like 90% of people, 90% of people will tell you X, Y, and Z person is a fascist, or they'll tell you X, Y, and Z person definitely isn't a fascist. And I'll ask them, can you define fascism? And they have no idea what it is. Number one, why are you saying anything if you don't know what it is? Number two is, that is completely and utterly unacceptable as a society. Fascism is probably the most destructive political ideology in the history of mankind. World War II, Nazism, genocides, Mussolini, Stalin, these are some of the worst political regimes that have ever existed. And not just because of the results. Some people like to say that socialism, Marxism, communism killed more people. That's not true. Fascism is what was one of the primary causes of World War II, and World War II's death toll is way higher than, for example, the Great Leap Forward with Mao. So why is it that our public discourse, our public in general, doesn't know what the word fascism means? And by the way, it's authoritarian nationalism. It is traditionalism, conservatism, ethnic nationalism, combined with authoritarianism. When you put those two things together, you get fascism. And so we look at this chart, for example. What is liberalism? People think liberalism, because of the way that we talk about it in the United States, is all the way to the left. That's not true. Liberalism is actually the foundational ideology of the United States. It is kind of in the center. I think it's odd that on this graph they put progressivism on this side, and I think that's probably because historically old school progressivism may have kind of fallen in this direction here, but in reality modern day progressivism, what progressivism ultimately matured into, is something kind of more in this range over here. Progressivism was more something that exists between your centrist, moderate establishment liberals and left-wingers. These days, people conflate progressivism and leftism. But when I was growing up and throughout much of my life, and you can ask older progressives too, progressivism was not liberal or not leftism. It was not socialism. It was not communism. It was something that was a little bit more to the left of your centrist, moderate liberals, but it wasn't socialism. It wasn't communism. And it was also a little bit libertarian. So if we look at this chart, first of all, okay, this axis is supposed to represent kind of like how much control the state has over your day-to-day life, your identity, your social issues. At the very bottom, we have libertarianism, anarchism, no rules, government doesn't interfere at all. At this extreme, you have things like child marriage because there are no laws. At this extreme, you have things like rape because there are no laws governing social issues. On this end over here, on this extreme, you have totalitarianism. You see it right here, by the way. You have fascism. You have the government coming in and heavily regimenting what you can think, what you can say, what you can wear, what you can dress, what kind of gender expression that you can have. The government may even assign jobs to you. You know, in some of the older, like Soviet Union, for example. Soviet Union would have fallen on this end. Very authoritarian, but also pretty left-wing. In the Soviet world, you were given aptitude tests and the government would tell you what you were going to be. You weren't allowed, like we are in the United States, to chart your own destiny. You would be assigned basically a track through life that you had to follow. Those are the two extremes. Now on this axis, left versus right, what left versus right actually means in terms of economics On the far right end of the economic spectrum, you have laissez-faire anarcho-capitalism. In other words, there are no rules, there is no state regulation on economics. Anything goes, no regulations, no contract enforcement, nothing. No taxation, no nothing. But on the very far left end, you have communism, you have socialism. You have ideologies that revolve around public ownership of the means of production, meaning you don't have private business, you don't have private capital, you don't have private industry. Everything is collectively owned by the public and it's redistributed out to the public. And on this end, basically because it's command economy, it's controlled by the state basically has full control over the economy. So this is a crude chart. It doesn't completely capture what politics is, but this is kind of the modern chart that the body politic kind of uses to understand politics. One moment, let me get a drink real fast because my voice does get hoarse if I go on too long. Hold on. Okay. Here's what I'm going to do actually. I'm going to take one of these blank charts because I don't really like the way that this one is laid out. I don't agree with some of its where they're grouping things, and it doesn't really make sense from a U.S. or modern perspective. Awesome. Nice big size. Copy image. That's too bad. Can I actually paint? Free paint. I have no idea what this Klecky thing is, but we're going to use this. Let's open up a file. That one I just downloaded. Where the hell did it go? Did I just download this? Maybe I didn't. I think I copied it. Yeah, I copied it. Okay, so now we're going to open it. And here we go. Okay. Whatever. This image. Okay, so one thing that I want to say while we're at it here, I hate when people say, I'm a centrist, I take views from both sides. That's not what centrism is. Centrism, it's in the word, it's in the terminology. Centrism. You are not a centrist, for example, if you take extreme ideas from this side, extreme ideas from that side. I don't know what you call yourself at that point, but you're not a centrist. None of your views are in the center. So here's the center, okay? That's a centrist. All right, do we have a text tool here? Come on, there's got to be a text tool here. What the hell? What the hell? There's got to be a text tool around here somewhere. Oh, wait. No? Oh, here we go. Okay. Center. Centrist. We'll make this 30. Okay, we need to go way bigger. Gotta go big or go home. There we go. There we go. Centrism. Centrism. Can we put a box around it? Oh, that's good enough. Okay. Now, in reality, liberalism basically encompasses, it's going to encompass pretty much like this. Maybe I went a little bit too far down that way. How do I edit undo? Liberalism basically encompasses like this. Okay. Now the reason I didn't go too far up on this scale is because this is the authoritarian scale. Liberalism is ideologically opposed to authoritarianism, but it's not necessarily opposed to libertarianism. The idea behind liberalism is core to its philosophy, the idea of liberty. So of course, liberals Liberalism is going to be pretty open to a lot of libertarian ideas, but it will not extend all the way to the bottom because liberalism recognizes that you do need to have some government interference to protect the rights of others. For example, right? If you had no government interference on our social issues, social values, then people could rape each other, they could murder each other, right? And now people don't have real liberty. They don't really have real freedom because you're getting your freedom taken away by other people in society taking it from you. Okay? That's liberalism. Liberalism is actually quite broad. In a global historical sense, it is. We don't talk about it that way in the United States. We pretend that liberalism means the left wing. That's not true. Now, over here, you have progressivism. And actually, I think it's probably more appropriate to say that progressivism looks something like this. Progressivism tends to be quite a bit libertarian, and the reason that it's libertarian, nice, I could do rotation and everything. Is that easier to read? Do a smaller text size, font size. The reason for this is that progressives are the ones who tend to be pushing society forward socially. Now, they come in opposition to conservatives, which conservatives tend to be over here. Would I put them in the libertarian? No, I would not put them in the libertarian camp. Conservatives are somewhere over here. You can see they're almost opposed to each other, which they quite often are. Maybe we could say maybe this axis is actually the progressive versus conservative axis. But we'll circle back to conservatism in a moment. Now, again, there is some overlap between conservatism and liberalism, okay? But we'll get to that in a minute. Progressives tend to be the ones that are pushing for things like the legalization of marijuana, things like acceptance of gay, trans, LGBT individuals, right? These are things where you are not using the state to enforce gender norms or anything like that. You're letting people live different, unique lives. Progressives will support furries. I'm a progressive. I support furries. I think it's a little weird. It's not my cup of tea, right? I think it's not my thing. All right, I'm gonna keep it real. But very core to my belief system is the idea that as long as you're not hurting someone else, be the weird person that you want to be. I do not care. I like weird, generally speaking. That may not be my flavor of weird, but I believe in freedom. I believe in liberty. I believe you should be allowed to. I'm a libertarian in that sense. Live your life as you see fit. Now, in addition to this, liberal or progressivism also tends to be a little bit further away from the center. Why? Because progressives tend to have this idea of the veil of ignorance in philosophy, the idea that you are structuring society around the idea that it should be fair and offer equal opportunity to everybody because you have no idea what circumstance you'll be born into. And to have a fair society, it makes sense then that you try to have an even playing field. Progressives will go out of their way to try to make it an even playing field by utilizing the government to do some redistribution, not socialism, but some redistribution in order to effectuate, in order to make it a reality that you do have something of an even playing field. What overlaps over here is another term that you guys hear a lot about, which is, let me actually do this. This is going to get real messy real quick. You get social democracy. This chart is going to look real ugly real quick. I know, not much I could do about it. Social democracy is more of an economic system. And that's why it I'm not placing it such that it's far in one extreme here or there, and it's more focused here in this economic. It's more focused on this axis. Social democracy as an economic system. Social democracy is the economic system of most modern Western liberal countries. And it was kind of born out of World War II era with people like FDR, where they were not socialists, they weren't left wing, but they also weren't like laissez-faire anarcho-capitalists. They believed that there was a role for government to come in, try to even the playing field, try to offer robust social services, do things like put regulations on workplace safety and having progressive taxation. Social democracy will have universal health care, for example. Now, there's a big overlap here between progressive and social democracy, and most progressives that you will meet will be social democrats for that reason, right? Now, on this end, we have, right next to it, we have another term that's very similar, but it's not the same. Democratic socialism. And what democratic socialism is, democratic socialism is similar to social democracy in terms of both of them have robust social welfare systems and regulations from the government and everything. But democratic socialism, social democracy is okay with being capitalist. And the capitalist range is basically, let me undo that. Capitalism is basically existing over here. I told you this is going to get real messy really fast. Capitalism. And the main thing with capitalism is that you do not have public ownership of the means of production. You don't have, oh, can I edit that? Damn it. You don't have command economy. You have different versions of capitalism. And the furthest it goes is basically going to be over here in social democracy. But democratic socialism is not capitalistic, and democratic socialism doesn't want to be capitalistic. It actually defines itself as a transition to, put like an arrow here, to socialism. And socialism is basically going to be over here. Now, socialism is public ownership of the means of production. Socialism is the idea basically is that from socialist perspective that you can't truly access freedom and you can't truly be free if you have economic pressures on you that keep you from accessing that freedom, which keep you in a constant state of just survival. In addition to this, they believe that having the state redistribute resources, well, two additional things here. Number one is that they actually might believe that it's more efficient if the government controls the economy from the top down. And then the other thing is that they believe that the government needs to come in and make things more equal, because otherwise people will take advantage of, they'll exploit people, they'll take advantage of people, and the economics will be rigged, and the powerful capitalists will wind up taking over the government. The opposite version of this is basically, you know, something like this, like corporatism. The idea that now capitalism, the capitalists, have now taken over, and really actually corporatism can be socially libertarian depending on its flavor. But the corporations now control the society because they've become more powerful than the government, or they've corrupted the government now. Okay, so socialism is like the opposite of that. Um, then you have communism. So here's the confusing thing. True communism basically exists over here. So I'll put that disclaimer here. So how do I put this? True communism, doctrinaire communism, uh, idealized communism. Because what communism actually is, what that term actually means is no currency, no classes, no state. You do not have a state. You do not have a government. You also don't have social classes. So you don't really have um, you don't have a hierarchy of social things. You don't have so it's down here on this end. And you also don't have currency. So like it's kind of weird. I don't even know if it fits well on the political compass. This is where the political compass starts to break down. That's ideal communism. Ideal communism has never existed. And the communism that did exist fell into this category here. Actually, let me do this. It fell into, actually, yeah, fell into like this category here. Communism. And the reason for that is because the communist regimes, the communist regimes that existed believed that they needed to have a dictatorship or an authoritarian government. They needed to crack down on sources of capitalism and sources of hierarchy in order to destroy those things first so that they could then usher in their ideal form of communism. Now, so ideally, what their idea was, we need to become authoritarian so that we can destroy the power structures that do exist in the world, and then we can actually move to the real communism. Now, you can imagine that this is inherently pretty corrupting because once you have power concentrated like that, a lot of the people up at the top in charge aren't going to actually want to, do the right thing or whatever. They're just going to use it as an opportunity to amass power. So in real life, communism always kind of went the route of taking these authoritarian regimes, and then they never actually did lead to the promised idealized communism that they advertised, either because it just wasn't practical or they never really intended to do it. They're just selling people on a lie. So let's circle back to conservatism now. So conservatism is socially very conformist, socially very aggressive. They don't want they want people to abide by very traditional gender roles. They don't like trans people, gay people, LGBT, all of that. They have very strong pressures to dress a certain way, talk a certain way, think a certain way, have your hair done a certain way, no body modifications, no piercing, no tattoos, so on and so forth. So socially it is it's fairly authoritarian. Now, moderate conservatism, your baseline conservatism is a little bit more authoritarian on the social values, but we haven't reached fascism yet, okay? Once you've gone from conservatism to reactionary to fascism, then we get up to here. In addition to this, conservatives tend to oppose left-wing economic ideologies, regulations, taxation, so on and so forth. So a lot of there are some conservatives that do fall a little bit more left of center, but they don't go very far than that. But there are a lot of conservatives that do fall on the economic, anarcho-capitalist, laissez-faire, free market capitalism side. So conservatism kind of spans this area here. Then you get, I don't know if it's worth drawing, but you get the reactionary and then you get fascism. Now, fascism is not left or right wing economically. Whenever you hear people argue about is fascism socialist or capitalist or whatever, and by the way, I didn't mean to draw it more on the right wing side here. It's kind of in the middle. The term third positionist from Nazi Germany was kind of part of this idea, which is they didn't really have like a strong ideological commitment to either economic extreme. Everything tied back to nationalism, it tied back to traditionalism, it tied back to isolationism and authoritarianism. As long as they thought it was good for the nation, for their ethnic national group, they would borrow elements of communism or capitalism. They didn't really care. It wasn't strongly economically minded. It is very strongly social traditional minded. Now reactionary is kind of in between. Reactionary is basically the thing that gets you to fascism. Reactionaries oppose social progress, and they'll oppose it so much that they wind up kind of like a strong reaction to clamp down on social progress, and this is why it leads to authoritarianism. And then down here, you have what we today refer to as libertarian. Now, historically, libertarian actually started as a left-wing libertarian movement, but I think that the way it exists in modern day is there's not a lot of left-wing libertarians that exist anymore. Most of them are falling in this category. And unfortunately, a lot of them who call themselves libertarian aren't even actually libertarians. They actually fall up here more on the socially authoritarian side. But ideally, as a distinct ideology, they should be over here, where they like deregulation of gun or drugs, deregulation of social things. They don't care about LGBT issues like conservatives and reactionaries, but they also are very much, they want the government not to be involved in economics, most of them. So most of them fall over here. Then you have, let's say, anarcho-capitalism and anarcho anarcho, I think it's what, syndicalism. And I'm just going to put this here. There's different branches of anarchism that I don't know that much about. I haven't dived into too much. We're just going to call this whole area here anarchism. You don't have much state involvement down here in this area. Now the issue with this is how do you ensure that people have freedoms, rights, and are being treated fairly? I don't believe you really can, right? Now, what exists in all these little areas over here that I didn't fill out, I don't know. I don't really care. It's not super important. These aren't really relevant. The political compass itself, it's really not as nice and neat as a square in real life. So it's possible that maybe the actual shape of politics is actually something that looks more like a weird blob like this or something, right? That's the problem with, you're trying to pigeonhole human psychology into nice, neat geometry. Probably not realistic or going to work. Well, that's basically the whole idea behind it. Now, me, what do I consider myself? I consider myself in basically this category here. I'm progressive, I'm liberal, I'm a social democrat. I'm going to close this. I'm not going to save it. I don't really care to save it. Save it in your brain, okay? Comparing this to the way they got theirs filled out, pretty similar. Okay, yeah, so syndicalism is kind of your libertarian left. And then you have anarcho-liberalism or anarcho-capitalism over here in this area here. Libertarianism, yeah, probably sounds about right. That's kind of where I put it, right? They call it left libertarianism. I think really left libertarianism is what you call progressivism these days. Conservatism is here, just like I said it was. Here's nationalism, fascism up in this area here. They're calling it right wing. I don't really believe fascism is really right wing. I think realistically, you look at the history, it could fall in either camp. Then you have communism right here, just like I said. Socialism right here, like I said. Democratic socialism is really kind of more here. Social democrat right here. Yeah, so you get the idea. Liberalism kind of takes the kind of center area here. All right. Now, let me explain to you guys why I'm a liberal and what is liberalism and why is it important. But give me a quick second. I'm going to use the restroom real fast, and I will be right back. Okay. All right. So liberalism. What is liberalism? Let's talk about the liberals, modern day liberals today, and progressives and whatnot. They don't realize they're doing this, and it's so hard for me to point this out. They are constantly on the defensive. They are constantly reacting. They are constantly fighting back against the arguments, the framing, the attacks that come from the right that liberals almost never ever make a affirmative, strong case for liberalism. But I am here today to tell you that liberalism is not only, and I am not exaggerating, I'm not just saying stuff, I will elaborate on this. Not only is liberalism the tradition, the history, the foundation of our country, of the US, of Western civilization, but liberalism is by far and away, empirically, by all evidence, the most successful political organizational philosophy in the entire history of mankind, period, end of sentence. Why do I say that? Well, what is going on here? Readers in the US deserve an explanation. Let me read this real fast. We're running short. Okay, they need fundraising. They always do. Okay. So, liberalism, in short, is basically the idea. Let's just read the Wikipedia version real fast. So, liberalism is about the rights of the individual. It's about liberty. It's about consent of the governed. This is a big one. This was a big, like ideological revolution in thinking that liberalism ushered into the world, the consent of the governed. And what that means is a legitimate government under the ideas of liberalism is a government that has the consent of the people that it rules over. Now, that's an ideal. You can't literally make sure that every single person in your society consents to the government they have, and of course, you can't please everybody in the society simultaneously. But the idea is, how do you create a government that is approximating that consent of the government? Well, you have representative government, you have elections, you make sure that the people actually have a voice and a say in how their government is run, and therefore you're very much closer to that idea of the people that are living in your society are consenting to it. They're voting, they're deciding how it's supposed to be run, right? You have political equality. In other words, rights apply to everybody equally. Everybody has an equal opportunity, things of that nature. And you have private property. Liberalism is not socialism. Liberalism allows you to engage in commerce, have your own business, buy your own things, have possessions that you call your own. And the state just can't come and just take it away from you. So liberals espouse various and sometimes conflicting views. That's the thing. Liberalism is actually a very broad ideology. It encompasses a lot of different offshoots over the years. Okay. But liberalism is an ideology, unlike a lot of ideologies before it, that was evolved out of the Age of Enlightenment. It says right here, right? The Age of Enlightenment was an era of human development where we developed science, we developed a method of rational thinking and of humanism. Rational thinking, by that I mean like logic, philosophy, being able to start laying out what makes reasonable belief? What makes a rational argument? What are fallacies? What is a valid logic structure? How do you determine if something is true or false? How do you engage in critical thinking? How do you test things to make sure that things are real? And out of that or out of that revolution of the Enlightenment era came the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution built on those ideas of rational thinking, critical thought, whatnot, to then apply to the real world. Okay, let's take those ideas and let's start studying the world and start to try to very systematically understand and start writing down the rules and laws that govern all of reality, right? And then liberalism was the political philosophy that evolved in the background of all of that. And so think about that for a minute. Think about how amazing that is. Liberalism is the ideology that evolved when humanity reached a level of advancement in consciousness and awareness and intelligence that human beings were starting to look at the world not through superstition, not through mythology, not through just tradition and oral tradition and stories that we told each other, but actually trying to critically evaluate, critically understand, have a high standard of what good proof, good logic means. Liberalism was the philosophy that evolved out of that. That's amazing. That's a story that we should talk about all the time. That's a story that liberals should be proud of. We are the political ideology that evolved when humanity had evolved to a stage of enlightenment where we weren't just bumbling creatures out in the wilderness living under mythology. We were starting to systematically look at how things work, why they work, and lay them out in excruciating detail and rational thought about these things, right? And liberalism was a rejection of monarchy that came before it. It was a rejection of the idea that good governance, good law was passed down through bloodlines, passed down through generations, passed down through an aristocracy. Liberalism was about merit, true merit, not just a slogan, but merit as in if an idea is a good idea, it should be able to make the case logically and consistently. It was about if you want to rule society, not even rule society, but govern society, you should be popular enough, you should be competent enough that you actually get voted in by the people. You're not just chosen by the elites, by the corporate owners or the people with all the money, or passed down as a monarchy, passed down through bloodlines. You have to earn it. The people have to look at you and see you are competent, you are representing of what our values are, and then we put you into office. And liberalism would go on to be the ideology, by the way, that ushered in the modern era of human civilization. And it is the political philosophy that defines what Western civilization means. You see people throw around the term Western civilization, and to a lot of them, they just mean white European. But Western civilization, if it actually means anything special, and if it actually means the thing that actually makes Western civilization special, that's liberalism. That is the system that built the Western world into a global superpower and created societies that were the healthiest societies in the world, the most economically dominant societies in the world, the most scientifically literate societies in the world, the most educated, the healthiest, the highest quality of life. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself here. Liberalism, as it started to take over the world, became, it correlated with a reduction in crime, a reduction in poverty, a reduction in war. Okay, when I said that liberalism is by far and away empirically the most successful political governing system in the history of mankind, I mean that with every fiber of my being, because all you have to do is look at the stats, look at the history. It is all there. And it's a story that we are remiss not to tell. It's a story that we have no excuse to not tell that story. It's a story that liberals should be proud of. I don't know why liberals run away from it. I feel like liberals are afraid to say that we believe strongly that our ideology is the best ideology. It's like liberals are afraid to say that yes, I do think my ideology, my system is better than yours because it is. It is. It is the ideology that led to less war, less poverty, less crime, that increased the living standards of all of humanity, that increased the economic output of the world, that formed trade relationships between different countries so countries have a mutual benefit not to go to war with each other, and so that they can trade things and get great products and things that they can't get in their country from other countries and build relationships with people from all around the world. Share ideas, share technology, share traditions, share foods. Educating the people more than any other ideology. Having science development more than any other ideology. Okay? Economically more dominant than anything else. Militarily more dominant than anything else. Why? Why is the military of liberal Western countries better than all the others? Because we focus on critical thinking, results, empiricism, being rational, not being overly emotional, because we do those things, the militaries that we produce are results oriented. They are disciplined. They are professional for all those reasons. You look at some of the most conservative countries in the world and their militaries, they venerate them. They blow them up as something larger than life. And all those things aren't necessarily bad, right? But there's a lack of treating the military with a respect, treating war, treating violence with the respect that it deserves, treating the military like you treat a gun. And by that I mean you have trigger discipline. You are not just shooting off in any direction just for the hell of it because you are obsessed with war and violence and you want to glorify it. You respect the power. You are responsible with the power. And just to show you that I'm not being errant when I say this, let us look at highest quality of life countries. Let's take the time and let's look at these stats to make the case. And my gosh, I'm getting a little bit warm here. Liberalism is so hot, it's so sexy that I got to take my jacket off, okay? Let's look at this. Countries with well-being over 60. Okay, so this is applied to over 60. Granted, we don't have much data in these countries here, but you could already imagine these countries aren't doing so well. The countries that are more conservative tend to be in the southern hemisphere, tend to be less developed. Okay, and I don't mean that in like a rude, demeaning, dehumanizing way. I just mean it in a matter-of-factly descriptive way. These are countries that are developing. They are developing over time, and as they develop, as is the case it seems throughout history, as a country develops, it does tend to become more liberal over time, and that's a good thing. But you could see the most successful countries for well-being are liberal Western countries, Canada, the United States. Now, the United States is doing a backslide right now, but it has been a liberal country, relatively speaking. Europe, the Nordic countries, for sure. Look at how dark green they are. These countries in Asia, these are countries that are developing, that are moving more into like a liberal trajectory. You can see that they're doing better than these countries that are more on the conservative bent. Japan, fairly liberal, all things considered. Australia, so on and so forth. Okay, let's look at some other stats here. Quality of life. I know this image is pixelated to shit, but I could just tell you right now, look at Switzerland, Denmark. These are the social democracies. These are the progressive countries. Australia, Finland, Germany, Spain, Japan, right? Somewhere in here is South Korea, I'm sure. Canada's fairly progressive. Where's the United States? We're in here somewhere. You get the idea. France, Israel. Now, you guys can hate Israel and all that, but compared to the other Middle Eastern countries, Israel is fairly, it's not as conservative as those other countries in the Middle East. Oh, here we go. 50 countries with the best quality of life. Here's a more clear picture. But again, these are your very progressive liberal countries. Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, Norway. Now, some people will say, oh, it's because they're ethnically homogenous. maybe it's not because they're ethnically homogenous. Maybe it's because they choose the right policies. Maybe in the United States you don't choose the right policies because you're constantly obsessed with race. You know what I mean? Germany, Australia, Netherlands, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Belgium. And by the way, these are like a lot of these countries are pretty diverse countries. A lot of these Western countries have a lot of immigration, have had a lot of immigration over time. Japan here is not white, but they have a high quality life. Ireland, France, Luxembourg, Spain. Here we have the U.S. U.S. is probably the most diverse country in the history of mankind. We're up in the top 50. Okay, so the idea that it's about ethnic homogeneity, no, it's about liberal policies. Singapore, South Korea, China, these are again, okay, China's not the most liberal, but it's become more liberal over time. South Korea, decently liberal. Greece, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia. What does Saudi Arabia and UAE have in common? They've been quite influenced by Western civilization, liberal countries compared to their other Middle Eastern counterparts. And yeah, they do have a lot of oil money too. That helps out a lot. But look, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, Croatia, Mexico. Okay, let's look at education. Education by country. Look at this. Okay, please stop with the animation. All right, let's get to. Either way you slice it, and I'm happy, by the way, that countries are becoming more developed. And as they become more developed, by the way, they tend to become less conservative over time. But dark blue, right? Highly educated, liberal countries. Even over here in Japan, in South Korea, in Australia. Let's look at let's look at PPP, purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity compares GDP between countries and it equalizes it out. Basically, it's like GDP per person because you could look at a country like the United States, say, oh, it has a higher GDP than Liechtenstein, for example. Liechtenstein's a smaller country though, so you want to do GDP per capita. When you do, again, the more liberal countries tend to have higher GDP per capita. Canada, United States, European countries, Australia, Japan, right? Let's look at crime over time. Global. Because liberalism truly became the dominant political ideology post-Cold War, right? There was kind of the Soviets versus the Western world during that time period. You can make the argument that even before then, liberalism was kind of dominating or starting to dominate. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, liberalism definitely became the world hegemony. The UN, mostly influenced, the most by the Western countries, NATO, even like the economic might that these, Western liberal countries have. Okay, so let's look at that one. Doesn't go far back enough. This one goes back to the 1300s, right? So 1300s. I mean, things have been declining over time. That's probably just due to economics. Okay, well, this graph goes back quite a ways. So around the 19, I mean, geez, we've been so low in comparison to where we were in the 1300s that it's hard to even tell. Let's look at rate of war over time. Looks like data on something like this is really messy. But look at this. Death and conflicts over time. So look at, even though you had big peaks and valleys, things were kind of on like a flat line until, look at this, the end of World War II and the advent of liberalism starting to dominate. And then we get in the 60s or so, the collapse of the Soviet Union. When did it really collapse? In the 80s? And we're not looking at a straight line anymore. We're looking at actually a precipitous collapse. Now, maybe it's too soon to tell. Maybe things shoot back up. But if they shoot back up again, that's going to correlate with a rise in right-wing authoritarianism again. Because right now, we're seeing a rise in illiberal authoritarian belief systems. And if we see an increase in war and conflict again, what that'll tell us is when we had the rise of liberalism, war and conflict decreased, and then it re-increased again when we had a rise in conservatism. Let's look at this. I'm curious if there's probably been some studies on it. Correlation between liberalism and education. Democratic peace theory. This is arguably the most well-known aspect of liberal peace. It argues that liberal democratic states are less likely to go to war with one another. Citizens who bear the cost of war can hold their leaders accountable and are thus more likely to prefer peaceful resolutions to disputes. Remember what I said, core tenet of liberalism is the idea of the consent of the government, that the government is representative of the population. Population votes them into power. So there's this theory here that you see decrease in war because when you have liberalism, citizens have more control over their government. And so citizens who bear the primary costs of war, who die in the wars, have more of an incentive not to send themselves to war. Economic interdependence. This was the whole, idea of the early liberal economics, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, the idea that having mutual trade between countries was a way to make it so that we are a bit reliant on each other. We benefit from good relationships with each other rather than going to war with each other. And the establishment of international law. Yes, this is also true that liberalism, especially after like World War II, World War I, tried to establish a system of conflict resolution between governments. Liberalism did that. Okay? Think about that for a minute. You guys take it for granted. Liberalism had the good sense to try to set up a global intra-government or intergovernment international system where other countries can resolve disputes without going to war with each other. What an amazing concept that liberalism put in place there. Now, people will criticize the UN, they'll criticize NATO, but what people don't really consider is the alternative hypothesis. Where would we be without that? Yes, it's not perfect. Yes, sometimes it's incompetent. Yes, sometimes it is not, it's not always as effective as we want it to be. But what we have to really think about is, what did the world look like before we even had that at all? And countries were more likely to go to war during that time period. So you kind of get the point there, okay? Now, I go on about liberalism, and we'll go on about it in a different time. I've talked about it before on some of my other videos. I did a whole video where I just listened to and I reacted to and I read about the rise of liberalism more in depth, about like the ideological underpinnings. And by the way, I need to make this point quickly. That flag is our flag as liberals. The history of the country, patriotism, that is our history, that is our patriotism. The history of the United States that's taught, the great history of it, is the history of liberalism overcoming and winning against other ideologies. During the American Revolution, we had the early version of liberalism that defeated the monarchy and established the Constitution with consent of the governed, with individual rights. It wasn't perfect, but it was a huge push forward. The philosophical underpinnings that inspired the founding fathers to have that revolution were literally called, or what we call now, the liberal philosophers. It was like a school of thought that emerged out of the Enlightenment era that was kind of a new school of thought, and it was its own trend that was going on at the time. This was John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Voltaire, even Madison and Jefferson were considered liberal philosophers. Look up a few more liberal philosophers. You should know these names, by the way. These are the names that were the inspiration, the philosophical foundation for the United States, for the Constitution, even the wording of the Constitution. Things like liberty, or with the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, comes from the concept of life, liberty, and state. It says right here from John Locke. John Locke is considered the founder of modern liberalism. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, this idea of free trade, of private property, of mutually beneficial economic arrangements. I'm not sure, I haven't heard of this Mary Wollstonecraft, but okay, liberal feminism. So she was one of the early ones who was arguing that women should be equal to men. Okay, that's a great thing, right? Liberalism, of course, when the country was first founded, they weren't at that level yet, right? But the liberal movement, as it evolved over the years, feminism and equality between the sexes was not something that evolved out of the conservatives. And the conservatives did not push that forward. Liberals did. Liberals decided to have the revolution against the monarchy. Liberals were the ones who were the abolitionists. They're the ones who decided to fight the Confederacy. They're the ones who decided that we needed a Bill of Rights to ensure that everybody had access to rights. They're the ones who pushed for desegregation. They're the ones who pushed for the child labor laws, for the public education system, for workplace safety standards, for the 5-day work week and having weekends off, for vacation time, for all these things, for desegregation, for the equality of women, for universal suffrage so that everybody would have a right to vote. All of those things, that trajectory of the United States as it was established and as it became better and more proud over time, all of those accomplishments were the push of liberalism. It was not conservatism. Conservatism pushed back against those things the entire history, the entire time, because conservatism is focused on maintaining the status quo, focused on even sometimes going backwards. So conservatism didn't want to change those things. It didn't want to change from the monarchy. It didn't want to make the slaves free. It didn't want to desegregate. It didn't want to give women the right to vote, because all of these things were significant changes to the status quo of what people were used to and the traditions that they had. Traditions, for tradition's sake, aren't a good thing. Traditions should be challenged, they should be questioned, and some traditions are worth changing. We don't want to maintain the tradition of slavery. We don't want to maintain the tradition of women not being equal to men. We don't want to reserve the tradition of children working in factories and getting their limbs blown off. The history, the foundation, and the tradition of the United States is the history of liberalism. Embrace that as a liberal. Embrace that flag. That is your flag. Capture that flag. Carry it. Declare that that flag stands for liberalism. The history of the United States is the history of liberalism. Not only the foundation, not only the progress that's made over the years, but we will pick up where they left off, and we will push the United States further into a more liberal direction, because that is what the United States represents. That is what Western civilization represents. And we are the proud legacy of that. And not only are we the legacy of that, we will build upon what others gave their blood, their time, their sweat, and tears to create. We will build upon it. We will make it better. We will pick up where they left off, just like they had picked up where their founding fathers or their fathers before them left off. That is the history of the United States history of liberalism. Now, putting that aside, okay, political violence in the United States is, and it needs to be said, everybody needs to know it, you should never shy away from it, it is overwhelmingly from the right wing in the country. Now let's look at this chart. So red is right wing, this black is liberal. This bar is called, I think, is it histogram? Histogram. Yeah, it's a histogram, I believe. What do you call these particular type? They're what? Stacked? Stacked histogram? Yeah. So the total, the entire bar itself represents like the total amount in that given year. And then the distribution of that total amount is represented by the colors. So in the year, what is this, 2019, we saw the largest amount of political violence halfway into Trump's presidency. And it's a little bit over 300, about, let's just call it 350 to be nice and easy. But we could see that almost 250 of that 350 was right-wing violence. It looks like something around, let's say, 10, 20 were left-wing violence. And a good, let's say, 40 or so was Islamic fundamentalism. Now, I won't try to die on this hill making this point, but Islamic fundamentalism is right-wing. Of course, Islamic fundamentalists won't get along with the right wing in the United States because although both of these are right wing, they are right wings that are opposed to each other. They have different religions. And each of these two want to dominate the country, but they want to dominate under their ideas. So the Islamic fundamentalists want to dominate under Islam. The right-wing terrorists tend to want to dominate it under either their race or their religion or their economic principles. So, but if you look at all these years, bottom line is almost every single year, right-wing violence is overwhelmingly the most common, and it's far more than left-wing violence. That doesn't mean that there isn't left-wing violence. This tells you very clearly that there is. But it's overwhelmingly from the right, and this should not come as a surprise to people. Right-wingers are constantly talking about taking up arms. They glorify the idea of taking up arms. They glorify militarism, not militarism as like self-defense, but militarism like let's invade our neighbors, let's invade Canada, let's invade Mexico, let's invade Panama. Let's go over there and let's like beat the shit out of these people and take over and rule because we are entitled to it. Let's take up arms against the government because we don't like the way the government is anymore. We don't like sharing. We don't like democracy. So we're going to take up arms. We're going to use our Second Amendment. We're going to take up arms and we're going to do a violent, bloody revolution so that we can be in charge. Let's take up arms to kill off any of these people we consider degenerate, evil demons, the way that they talk about people. Black people, Jewish people, trans people, LGBT people, immigrants, Mexican people, Muslim people. You hear it all the time on the right. They view other people as like an existential, violent threat against them. And all of these things coalesce together to make a population on the right that is heavily predisposed to violence in a way that you don't see with other political ideologies. It's also worth pointing out that there is research on the brain differences between people who tend to be right-wing versus people who tend to be conservative versus liberal. Conservatives have an enlarged amygdala. And the amygdala is the fear center of your brain. It is the emotional fear center of your brain. And so it makes a lot of sense when you pay attention to right-wing media. It's constantly about things that they need to be afraid of. This person stabbed this person. Violence is out of control. Crime is out of control. The immigrants are coming to kill you. The Muslims are coming to kill you. China's coming to kill you. Other countries are out to get you. The people want to trans your kids, and the LGBT and the perverts and blah, 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 and the pedophiles, and everybody's coming to get you, right? Constant fear mongering, constantly convincing people that it's always an existential threat that they need to be armed, ready, and loaded to do something about. So violence is it's in the ideology on the right, at least modern day version of the right, the way that they talk about things, the rhetoric that they use, the propaganda that they use, and it shows up in the data that they have been overwhelmingly the most violent. We cannot, it's just physically impossible. We cannot have a world where we don't have the political divide, we turn down the temperature, if the right itself is not willing to address the violent rhetoric on their side. We can't do anything about that. They're in charge of themselves. If they want to continue being violent and using hyperbolic, sensational, fear-mongering rhetoric, there will be a lot of violence in society because they are injecting it into society and they are hostile and picking fights with everybody. This is unsustainable. We can't have this. This tends to lead to authoritarian right-wing regimes that wind up imploding on themselves over time, like we saw in World War II, or just a long, slow process of us all getting more and more violent and having a society that's degraded around violence and instability and what's the word I'm looking for? Something about being unhealthy. Not disorganized, not disorderly, although those kind of apply, but not disunified, even though that applies. The word I'm looking for is dysfunctional. This is not sustainable. And the people who come by to say both sides, both sides, both sides, both sides, all you're doing is constantly lending obfuscation, whitewashing, downplaying, shifting, and deflecting away from this mass amount of violence that's going on the right. This has to be addressed. We have to be able to talk about this. We have to be able to not be PC about this, because this is legitimately a real issue. We cannot solve the problems in this country if we do not solve all of this violence that's going on. And pay attention, by the way, because throughout Obama's presidency, yes, you still had more right-wing violence than anything else, but it wasn't that high. Once Donald Trump takes office, 2017 through here's 2021, he leaves office. But you could see that this spike in violence is it's centered around Donald Trump. And as Donald Trump leaves office, 2021, we start to see it come back down again. Now, I guarantee you, I bet you, I would make a strong bet with somebody, maybe $200, $300, that over the next couple of years, we're going to see this go right back up again because Donald Trump is back in office. He is hostile to everybody else. He is inflaming tensions. He is constantly talking about locking up his political rivals. He refers to half of the country as enemies. And he's making the rhetoric between him and the other people on the right are making his base emboldened, fearful, hostile, extreme. We're going to see more violence over time. I was going to react to some of these videos. I think I'll hold off on these till next time because I'm getting a little bit tired here and this stream has been long enough. But we'll talk about some of these things. I mean, one thing this is kind of relevant, is Kyle Kalinske here. He's talking about there was a mass shooting on homeless camps that have been going on recently. This came after Fox News hosts, and this ties back into the whole political violence thing. Fox News hosts on the other day saying we should just take homeless people, give them lethal injections, just kill them all. And then you have people out on the streets who are actually going around killing homeless people. This is exactly what I'm talking about, that the rhetoric on the right, it dehumanizes people and it encourages, emboldens, and utilizes violent rhetoric, and it inspires people. It creates a psychology, a rationalization of the mind of people who are on the right, that violence is normal, that it's acceptable, and that it's the answer, and that it's needed because things are so bad that they have to engage in violence. At any rate, that's going to be it for me tonight. We'll have plenty of time in the coming days to talk about all kinds of different topics. If you like my content, if you like my perspective, if you want to see liberalism make a comeback, strong, patriotic, pragmatic, practical, realistic, rhetorically effective liberalism, like, share, subscribe, share my channel, share my videos with other people that you know, family members, other people who are like-minded liberals, other people who want to hear the message. Let us start making liberalism popular again. There are people like me out there. There's Destiny. Okay, I know some of these people got scandals of their own. You got Destiny, you got Kyle Kalinske, you got Vosh, you got Brian Tyler Cohen, you have Ezra Klein, you have Connor Points. He's a conservative, but he's very reasonable, I think. You have Pisco, I'm sorry. You have Breaking Points, Crystal Ball. You have a lot of new ones that are coming up too that I'm going to be paying more attention to as time goes on. And even ContraPoints. ContraPoints is cool too. She barely puts out videos anymore, but when she does, they're bangers. Let us take an active role in trying to promote liberal ideology, liberal rhetoric. And again, I cannot stress this enough. Do not spend all of your time just reacting to, defending, and arguing back against things that Republicans and right-wingers bring up, because if you do that, what you're doing is, here is the entire realm of different ideas and concepts that are out there in the world, and because you're only focusing on what Republicans want to argue and focus on, you are reducing what we're talking about and what the public is focused on, and everything over here is liberalism, and you're not even talking about it. You need to do what I did today, which is make an affirmative case for liberalism that has nothing to do with responding to and arguing and talking about the topics that conservatives and the right wing want everybody to focus on. You don't have to even pay them any mind. Take the football and run away with it. Talk about liberalism. Talk about how successful it's been throughout history. Talk about the difference between liberal and conservative states. Conservative media cherry picks. They talk about, for example, the exodus out of California. You know what they don't talk about? They don't talk about the exodus that's been going on from conservative states. Look at this right here. The red means population decrease. Where is the most population decrease in this graph? It is in the rural, conservative, red state areas. But you didn't know that. And the general public doesn't know that, because the only thing that we've been talking about is a little amount of decline in California. And so everything else is out of sight and out of mind. You need to focus not just on what they want you to focus on, but actually going out there, finding the info, finding the data, finding the history, and talking about what you want to talk about. Make arguments that they're not used to responding to. Make arguments, bring up points, bring up topics, bring up information that the public is not used to hearing. Talk about the history of liberalism. Talk about the philosophical underpinnings of it. Talk about how wonderful the ideas are. Okay, it's very based. Okay, that's it for tonight. Like, share, and subscribe. Do your thing, Mr. Hex. Mr-Hex-US on YouTube. Okay. Good night and good